It will take nothing short of 100 proof living to restore lives. Join a conversation between a cop and a criminal with Brian Yates and Chris Pridmore, working to inspire and motivate others, rebuilding the communication breakdown. This is the 100 Proof Living Podcast.
Well, welcome back to Conversations with a Cop and a Criminal. I'm Brian Yates.
And I'm Chris Pridmore, and I'd like to welcome our guest this morning. Simone Ochrym is joining us, and I'm really excited about having you here today, Simone. Your background is in nursing, which is nice because I know we'll get some real candid conversations. But what's been interesting is, your approach to dealing with some challenges that you've had in your life, as well as your unique ability to tell a story with passion and motivate others to do other things. So with that, I'd just like to hear, how do you do that?
Well, I always tell people the way I do it is that I guess at the darkest moment of my life, I picked up everything that I knew. And my son, he battled a decade of addiction, in and out of active addiction. He finally lost his life in September of 2016 to an opioid overdose. And he was only 26 years old. But during that decade, I educated myself thoroughly on addiction and recovery. I cannot tell you how many books I have read on it. But also during that time, I became a macro-organic photographer. So I would spend a lot of time rolling around the garden, taking very, very close-up pictures of organic stuff like flowers and dirt and rocks. And but I actually mastered photography pretty well at that time. And that was kind of like more of a release, like an escape. And I have a bachelor's in nursing, and nursing is probably one of the best educations you can get for dealing with life. So after my son had passed away, I put it all together. And I said, I took a lot of research classes in college, and I decided I was going to do a project, Chasing Nirvana Clean, and I was going to focus on people in sustained recovery. I do have a few people that have less than 5 years in my project, but 5 years was really the hallmark for sustained recovery as far as I was concerned. And I wanted to tell their stories of what they did, the how and the why they entered recovery and how they stayed in recovery, to make a roadmap for others to see this is how you do it. And so but I did tell their story of addiction, because it actually, they couldn't really tell their story of recovery without their story of addiction. So I kind of put the whole thing together. And what we have is they're all streamlined. You have the person going through early addiction. What are the root causes of people coming into addiction? Going through that time to the turning point, because everybody knows that moment where the light bulb goes off and says, I have to quit this. Early recovery, long-term recovery, and what's their advice for others. So I really wanted to really show people this is recovery. Right. And these are modern-day role models for today. I always tell people the recovery is really the journey of the hero in literature. If you know Indiana Jones, you know his story. He keeps trying to do what he wants to do, the right thing, but obstacles keep appearing. And once you think he's reaching his goal, another obstacle falls in. And he ultimately conquers all the obstacles and he reaches his goal. That is the story of recovery. They're modern-day role models.
One thing I wanted to just jump in there real quick is, Simone, when we first realized that we were going to have the opportunity to have you join this, I went on and looked at your blog and looked through several of those stories. And the thing that was probably the most compelling to me was, I don't know if you'd call it a mission statement, but there's a kind of an about section. And you talk about rebranding. Mm-hmm. And that really hit home with me, because one of the things we've done historically on this podcast is to try to show other perspectives, right? And so sometimes we've come shoulder to shoulder with people in law enforcement and tried to kind of humanize the badge, so that there's this stigma against law enforcement right now that we're trying to help kind of create a narrative, have discussions with real people in law enforcement to show people that are not in law enforcement that they have real stories, and that they bleed the same way, they have the same hardships when they go home. And for me, having a career in law enforcement, I can tell you early on in my career, I didn't see the addicted community. I didn't see the offending community as much more than just a call that I was going on, right? And so over time, now I have a number of family members that have struggled with addiction and friends. And so it's become more real to me. And now I'm much more drawn into those stories. So if I'm out on a call, I go into a situation that might be completely chaotic, and I'm trying to see their story. And one of the things I think you do so well is you tell these individuals' stories. And so there's an addiction story that is part of it. There's part of it's a recovery story. But those are two components of their bigger story, right? They're real people that, were once little kids, and then they ran into some challenges, and their paths all look very different, but all of us have a story. And so I really appreciate the work that you do. And I think you do an amazing job certainly for people in the addiction and recovery community, but for people outside of that community. You do a great job of telling a story that really humanizes it. And I think will help draw connections where people may now be more willing to reach out to someone who's struggling with addiction because they see a deeper story there than just the stigma of addiction.
Oh, thank you so much. I agree. That was what part of my mission was, to rebrand people who are struggling with addiction and to really bring them back to the human part. Because you're right. When I went to nursing school about 1 million years ago, we didn't even cover addiction. It was in like the destitute, chapter in the book. This is how you get destitute. And so even the medical community still is really coming up to the task of seeing the disease of addiction as a disease. But mostly people, when I was growing up, if you heard the word addiction, everyone ran to the hills, Mm-hmm. And I want people to know that these are people and that we all have a story and that we all have a journey. And even though you go through maybe 10, 20, maybe sometimes 30 years of your life where you're struggling in and out of active addiction, that during that time, you're still learning things. You're still achieving goals. I mean, even if you go into recovery, and when you read Chasing Nirvana Clean, all the different stories, one thing that's profound is that you see a lot of young men who entered formal recovery more than 30 times.
Right.
Never give up. But when you speak with them, they've learned something every single time. It might take them a little bit more time, but that doesn't mean that you walk away, So, and I wanted people that were struggling for more than 5 years to see that they weren't unique, but they were also had the opportunity to go and beat this and really get a more normal life.
Yeah, I think that's a couple things really stand out to me to what you're doing. I mean, obviously it touches my heart. I think the 5-year window was smart to do it that way because we do struggle. There's something, it's not anything magical, I know, but especially for somebody like myself that's in recovery, we sit in a lot of rooms and hear a lot of stories, and I think it's easy to get numb to the same story.
Yep.
But yours doesn't do that. It brings that compelling life to it.
I took a lot of care on that. That was one of the biggest challenges of doing Chasing Nirvana Clean, because when I first started, all I did was, I made my Instagram page and I put out an email on Facebook, like help anybody would like to participate, basically, and a lot of flyers. I had a lot of people. Most of the people were under 5 years. They were very early recovery, but that wasn't going to give you the whole story of how do you do recovery for 20 years?
Right.
And that's what I was interested in. How do you do it and stay there? And how do you take away the chaos out of your life? So I think those people who are, and it's hard for somebody who's been in recovery 25 years to come forward and go, you know what, that was me, because now it's in the past.
Right.
So I really had to look for those people, and I was fortunate that they came to me. I really am very grateful to them because their stories are so compelling. But one thing I always tell people who are in recovery, if you're going to tell your addiction story, before you tell it, tell your recovery story.
Right.
Because that's what's important.
Absolutely.
So that's one of my missions, is to turn everybody inside out. When I hear people talking and it's strictly the addiction story of mayhem, I have to shake my head because
they're not out of it yet.
They're not out of it. Yep. And they're also making the public, especially those who might have biases toward them to begin with, now they're thinking, yeah, you're exactly what I thought you were. Why are my tax dollars going to you? So you have to really think about recovery when you're speaking rather than the mayhem, you know.
Yeah, you had one participant on this that this I think illustrates the point I was trying to make. Is I know this individual very well. He's got a prominent story. He's been all over the place. I have a lot of respect for him. I really do. I think he's a great human being. And you referred to him as R, and I didn't even realize it was the R I knew until I got to the story. I'm like, oh wait, I know him.
Well, next time they're printed, he'll have his whole name.
No, that's fine, but I just love that because we do have to. There is still that anonymity that some people are comforted. I personally don't. I don't espouse the anonymity because it's a fertile ground for me to relapse. Yeah. But I did. It just illustrates exactly how different this is, and I would encourage our listeners to make sure you check it out because it really is amazing. But it does. We talk about stigmas a lot on here, and we're talking about the medical community. And in January, I have the opportunity to speak on a panel that, with the American College of Emergency Physicians on stigma in the ED. Where things change and what this feature does and what Brian and I have talked about the show is when we're making generalizations, it's real easy to put people in general boxes. You're making eye contact and forcing us to make eye contact with individuals that actually have found hope and found recovery. Otherwise, it's just one person sharing one war story with another person sharing a war story. There is victory and hope, and these are the types of things that we need to get out there more.
Yeah, Sorry,
Simone. Let me just add too, because looking at those, I love the idea of a picture, and Chris said it there. You're kind of making eye contact with them, and I think what kind of our coaching or our advice for people to have better interactions with any difference, whether it's law abiding, law violating, whether it's addicted or someone that hasn't struggled with addiction, or whether it's political parties or whatever it is. When there are those differences, when you see that picture of someone, you recognize there is a story there, and that's what we dive really deep into in learning to appreciate people. It's this idea of I'm going to choose to look for the common things. Typically, when you hear that stigma, that label of addiction, and that person is an addict, just like you said, it used to be in the back of a book. It used to be this kind of discarded, we don't want to deal with it type thing, and I think a lot of us in our American culture have just developed bad habits. And unintentionally so, but still the same. You look at the homeless veterans. We don't want to talk to them because we want to hope, try to ignore that they're there. You look at the addicted community. Now everyone's affected by it. And this idea of we have to choose to do something different. And where Chris makes a great point all the time is making eye contact. I think what you do is a phenomenal job because you're an artist with your photography, but you put these people up there in such a real way. And I think it allows people a safe way to kind of peer in, read about them, and really take a good long look at these people and recognize, that person is actually just like me. Instead of, I see that person has this difference from me, and then just discard them. Well, they're an addict, so I don't, you do a great job of putting it right in front of people, and I wish there was a way to just somehow mass message that out to everybody.
Well, that was part of the whole thing. Because being a macro-organic photographer, I've taken a lot of pictures, and I really felt that photography is a way to speak quietly. And Chasing Nirvana Clean is actually a very quiet exhibit when you go to it. It's almost like a quiet room, and everyone's reading. It's like the library version of recovery. But you have to submerge into this person's life. And the only rule with the picture is you could be in or out of the picture. I don't care if you don't want to be in the picture. We could take a picture in another way. And there are a few pictures, like I have a little dog in my show, and he's wearing her AA medal, and that was her comfort zone. So that was fine with me, but I just wanted to depict your recovery. So I really tried hard to have everybody say, this is part of my recovery. And no matter what it was. And the only hard rule was you can't scare me, and that was it. And it was different because I'm a macro-organic photographer is all by herself in the garden with a pretty big lens. And now I had to go and I had to really become up close and personal to people all of a sudden. That was a switch. But it was part of the learning process, and we have to see that our lives are really journeys. They're not what you think they are, and where you end up is never where you plan.
Right.
Well, and as you indicate, it's a journey. So kind of in the past few years that you've been, 12 years now that you've really been impacted by addiction. and until now, certainly things you're going to continue to learn on your journey going forward. But how has your view of addiction changed over the past few years?
Well, when my son first started getting involved with drugs and things like that, I thought I was pretty well prepared to help him into recovery. I'm a nurse. My husband's a physician. I was raised by an alcoholic. I seem to have had addiction around me my entire life. And, things change, and people's views of drugs have changed drastically since I was a kid. Because believe me, when I went to school, we all smoked pot in the parking lot before going to school, and nobody said a word. But now today, drugs are more accepting that are harder drugs, whether it's meth, cocaine, or heroin. And these are huge crises right now. But I think the mostly I have changed is that you have to meet people at their point in addiction and what they're going through. If you don't connect with that person, they will never, ever stay in recovery very long. And that was the biggest issue. My son passed away in 2016. So we were struggling through the healthcare system and things like that from 2010 to 2016. The world is a new place now. I wish my son had made it this far, because I think he would have definitely clicked into the recovery movement that's going on now. And people who are going into recovery today, it's a much more accepting thing. There's a lot more services that are available. I just think the way it has evolved has been very successful as far as opportunities to go into recovery, and also the way you see people in society. It's no longer a disease that you're going to catch, but it's something that you have to combat.
Yeah, I think that to your point, recovery has changed quite a bit. I mean, I'm fairly new to the recovery world myself over the last 2 years. But what I have found is that at least having more options allows me the opportunity to connect with that human connection that I will need. Now, I'm a huge advocate of the spiritual component, and it has to be addressed, and it was addressed in my life. And that's really, in large part, why I'm sitting here with you today. But the second piece around it is the humanity of it, the tactics. And a lot of times it's just having somebody that you can kind of relate to on that level to say, look, walk with me for a minute, and we'll figure. You might not know what tomorrow looks like. It kind of looked like this for me. Have a little bit of faith and keep moving forward. I think that eye contact thing I was talking about earlier really does play there, because a person might be willing to go ahead beyond today, but the fear might be really buffeting that a little bit. And I really think that in our recovery community we have now, I know in mine, I have people I can call anytime. And it's a beautiful thing. So, and messages like you have now give options too. Your display right now is at Connections in Canandaigua.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it'll be there until the end of December. I'm very proud of Chasing Nirvana Clean. It's been on exhibit for almost a year and a half consistently, which is a big thing to do if you're a non-famous photographer. Yeah. So I've been really happy. It's gone all across Western New York. It's going to be going down to Pennsylvania next year. Awesome. And I'm still booking months for next year. So I'm hoping that I can get it through, going through Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And, for other people to see it, I've done a lot of traveling the last few months, and I'm always going back and forth for some reason. And I always ask people about recovery and stuff like that. And I'm actually surprised how void certain states are when it comes to services for addiction recovery. Right. And they could tell you there's a problem. But when you say, well, what services do you guys have? Crickets. They're
limited and they're largely ineffective. We have a national rating system through Shatterproof that's going to be coming out this year called Atlas. And the whole point of that is to go across the country and find out where you can actually get treatment, to educate people on what options are even out there. Yeah. And in a scary way, there's a lot of places that don't have options, and what they do have is not really following the methodologies that we know that work today.
Right. And, I always speak up for the 12-step programs because I know with my exposure of talking to people in recovery, everyone gets very touchy when you talk about 12-step programs. And they're very effective, though. Mm-hmm. They're excellent. I know it's hard work, but that's part of the process of recovery, is really changing how you live your life. Right. You can't be you the way you are right this moment and be in recovery because you have a addiction issue. You're struggling with substance abuse still. So you have to learn to live without it. I think 12 steps should be taught in schools. You know?
Because it's teaching you when you got a mind in chaos, no matter what's causing it, at least it's giving you some options to follow a realistic path. That's the thing I love about it, is when my mind couldn't figure out anything, I at least knew a couple steps to take here to figure it out. One was recognizing I had a problem.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people when I was reading all these books constantly for my son, really, what you learn is that the recovery movement is really an education of how to live life well. If you want to meet somebody who knows how to live life well, meet somebody in recovery. And that's what so many people who don't struggle with substance abuse issues, what they never get the opportunity to do is really delve into themselves because they don't think they have to. And that's one thing it's one of the benefits of struggling with substance abuse is that you're put on the spot and you're forced to really take apart your life and figure out why you are the way you are.
Now, it's an interesting viewpoint because I think all of us have brokenness, and some of them are in different areas, and some people take different tactics or different paths to try to deal with that brokenness, whether it's the loss of a loved one or a divorce or a bad childhood or struggling in different ways. I think what I'm hearing from you and what I see in all of the people around me that are in recovery, they have developed a skill set that a lot of people don't have. And some of it is just that ability to reflect much more intentionally rather than just kind of going along like a pinball machine, just bouncing around by whatever life throws at them, and whatever consequences come from their decisions, they're just kind of used to being able to just fly over to the next bumper. But the people in recovery are compelled, like you said, on the spot to do a deep dive into their own life and their own mind and their own heart. And that's something that a lot of times people that haven't struggled with that don't have the ability to do that. And like you said, they don't think they should. And I think one of the things we always try to do is tell people there is another way of doing things that can be much more hopeful and can be much more pleasant in life than just struggling in a way that seems kind of fruitless.
One thing that I'm chewing on here a little bit, what you said earlier, you were talking about how you kept, I'm shifting gears a little bit here, but one of the things you talked about was that a lot of your subjects, like men, have the 30 some, and that's not uncommon. Yeah. I feel fortunate that I had 6, but mine were mostly outpatient, believe it or not. So it is a thing that does seem to be predominant in the male community as well. But there's also the flip side. And Brian and I were talking about this morning, and I wasn't really sure how to approach it with you, but I'm seeing in the mother space, young mothers. Mm-hmm. So you've got a different angle in that, you're grieving the loss of your son, and you've taken a proactive measure to put out what I think is just unbelievably touching tribute to how to do things, more effectively. But I see it the other side. I live in an environment that has a lot of young mothers that are struggling with addiction and recovery, and a lot of times trying to do it for their children, but the grip of it's so much there. At the same time, we've got social economic issues where the father might be in prison, or he might be an overdose and passed away or whatever. I'm curious, from your perspective and what you've seen, what advice would you give to those mothers in terms of not only in trying to move beyond to better days, but at the same point deal with being a single mom, with this actually being part of your life?
Well, I think a big part of it is really being responsible to your children. Children, as soon as you have children are number one. Mm-hmm. Number one is flat out. And you have to give enough information to a child in order for them to understand what's going on, but you don't have to overload them on information either. I'm not a huge supporter of people bringing their children to AA or something like that. I think it's an adult place with adult problems, and children should be spared it. I really do.
Agreed.
I think if you're a single mother and you're going through the recovery process, use everything that you have ever learned in the recovery process as to be a mother. The recovery process, the way it teaches you to self-evaluate and to treat other people, is exactly what motherhood is all about. It's about compassion. It's about empathy. It's about being grateful to have that child, and always appreciation. I always tell everybody, throughout this whole journey, what I really learned was there's only a few things that are important in life and that will guide you through life, and that is compassion and empathy, gratitude, appreciation, and always forgiveness, and really learn what true forgiveness is. You can't teach children to be compassionate individuals when you're holding grudges for 20 years and exploding every Thanksgiving, about the same thing. So I really think if you take what you're learning in recovery and just twist it a little bit into what a mother should be, I think you've got it right down, And I think what we're seeing in the recovery community today is a lot of young mothers who are in recovery who are becoming fantastic mothers. Yeah. They're getting it down. And I don't know if they would have been that great of a mother if they never had the experience of the recovery process.
I think that same lesson can be learned for contributors to society in any way. Yeah. I know for me, I was an absolute detriment to society for about 5 years, absolutely damaging human being to be around. In recovery and the lessons I've learned, I think I know more about what it takes to be a better human now than I ever did in what was quote unquote normal or sober. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's all about humanity. It really is.
We're forced in that place of rigorous honesty. We have to deal with a reality that's outside of our control. We all are in that place, truthfully. But when you're in recovery, you're forced with it every single day. Whereas I think we can get lazy without having that. I've said this before, I feel blessed that I have a label to what my problem is. I know what to go after. I feel a little bit like it'd be a difficult battle if you didn't know exactly what you're dealing with.
Well, I think that's where judgment comes in. Mm-hmm. I think from little kids, we've been kind of, especially I'm almost 60, but we came from a generation where judgment was the name of the day. Everything was judged, and we were taught to judge people on how well they could dance to disco or something of that craziness. And what we've sprouted also is very judgmental children. And I think we have to take a step back of the judgment things and stop making quick judgments on people as a whole and start giving people just the human side of yourself. And you don't have to have an opinion on everything. And that was probably one of the biggest lessons I learned.
How dare you?
I know. That was hard. I was like, oh, my God, yeah. I don't have to have an opinion, and I don't have to voice an opinion, Well,
but you keep talking about things that I think are fundamental that we have lost. We've lost because we've gotten so busy or because potentially the family's been fractured. There's a lot of research and things that people will point to sociologically on how did we get to this point. But you're talking about being intentional. You're talking about taking ownership as a parent and then also as an individual. And I feel like, we're just in this rushing river in our culture, and nobody's going anywhere intentionally. They're just banging around. And it's a refreshing to hear you say, and someone that's still in a place of pain and that has traveled a difficult road. But here's what I heard. When my son started taking drugs, I went and did the research. And you equipped yourself the best you could, because at the time you didn't know that much about addiction and all of the pitfalls that would come and how to connect him with help. But you took responsibility for yourself as a parent and went and did everything that you could. And I feel like there's a lot of people out there that are questioning themselves because they have a family member or a close friend that is struggling with addiction. And I think the encouragement here, and also a little bit of the coaching, is, hey, do something about it. Go get yourself educated. Go to things like, galleries where you can learn more about other people that are in addiction, and go, read about it and equip yourself in a way so that you don't just stand by quietly, but that you can offer help when help is asked.
Right. You really have to speak up. Like when I was a young adult, I lost many friends through drug overdoses and not DWIs, because they died in auto crashes from alcohol, but I lost a lot of people. So that was my greatest fear, was losing my son. But I really do think that you have to speak up, and you can't just feel sorry for somebody. That doesn't help anybody. And it's, feeling sorry for yourself is really kind of like a selfish thing of cuddling, self-cuddling. And you have to speak up, no matter how uncomfortable it is, because honestly, the world won't end if you speak up. That's when you should speak up,
Agreed. I think that coddling comment you just made, a lot of times we're so cautious about calling people out on things because we don't want to push them further into it, when actually a lot of times when we're coddling them, we're just buying them time so they can go use again.
Yeah, I was very confrontational.
Yeah, there's balance. I get that sense.
Yeah. No, honestly, I was like on my toes, and I always look back, like, how did I, because I see it as I lost my son, and I'm like, how did this happen?
Yeah.
But some people, there's twists and turns to everything in life, and if you lose a child to an overdose or something, it's not completely your fault, you know. There's all these factors, you know, and I don't think people should take it on as a failure or something like that. My son taught me a lot during his time, and I was lucky I woke up very early in his addiction, where I've always been kind of a quasi-Buddhist Christian, you know, and I woke up very quickly and realized this guy was teaching me lessons. And, you know, I always have this little quick story of, he was out in Rochester, and he called, and when he left, I was very upset that he left, because I was afraid he was going to die. And he finally called. It was a really rainy October day, so I knew he'd come back. And he finally called. I get there, and he wants $5 from me to pay the guy who let him use his phone. And I'm like a raving mom, you know. I crinkle up the $5 and I give it to the guy, and I'm like, God. And, you know, I asked my son what he was doing during this time, and, you know, he tells me he was reading letters for people who either couldn't understand the context of what the letters were, or they didn't really have the reading skills. And of course I get bent out of shape, and I'm like, well, why didn't you charge them $5 a letter? Immediately, and I could still see him in the car. Yeah. And he looked at me and he humbled me like that. He said, why would I do that? They have nothing compared to us. He goes, you know, even there in an addiction, he had more humanity than I did without an addiction. So he really humbled me. And that was one of the moments that I really realized he was teaching me. And it wasn't until a year later that I realized and became very thankful to that guy with the $5 phone, because my son went into formal rehab. And if it wasn't for him, I would never have had the opportunity to drive my son to formal rehab. So you have to really kind of look at things on the whole, rather than just a gut moment of what's happening. And for all of us who are struggling in addiction, or with somebody struggling with addiction, there are lessons to be learned, and it's all about you going to a higher level of humanity, you know, and to pay attention.
I feel like with what you just described, you were the embodiment of what the Serenity Prayer talks about, and I hear this throughout your story today, and I've seen it in some of the work you're doing, is that I see you take control over what you can.
Right.
And I see, even in something so tragic as the loss of your son, I'm not sensing blame or anything like that. I see you saying, here's the piece I own and I have to do something with, even right down to lessons that you've learned in such a tragic environment. It's such an embodiment of how we're supposed to behave through this whole thing, to be healthy. It's not saying there's a right or wrong, but for you to ever be healthy, it's my perception that these are ways that others could learn from. I know myself included. Because we get so easy. We blame the outside circumstances. We blame others for why we don't get things done. And ownership is really the core of it all. If you don't own it and you don't move forward with what you can actually deal with and be grateful for what you have, we drown.
Oh, yeah. You really, no matter what you're doing, I mean, there are tip-offs that you're always in a learning process. And I feel bad for people who just zip up their coat and barrel out the door because they're missing all the opportunity. And, you know, we learn during the hardest times of our lives. No one ever learned anything from a birthday party. Nothing. Even when you get your diploma at graduation, which was one of the proudest days of my life, I didn't learn a thing. Nothing. It was gone like that. But it's those hard times that bring you down to the dirt, where you have to really struggle to get back up. That's where you learn. And what you find there is compassion. You find all those important things in life, and it's all about you learning how to be a better person on earth. You know, it's really, you know, I hate to say this, but it's really soul work. It's truly soul work. And you have to go, you really, you know, if you want to rise above it all, you have to do the soul work. You know, that was my son's journey. And I'm thankful for him, and I'm thankful for his journey. He taught me a lot, you know.
Well, I tell you what, I really appreciate your message, no doubt about it. And Brian, I don't know if we're at that point now where we're going to kind of wrap things up. Did you have anything you wanted to close with?
Wow. Simone, thank you so much. Not just for coming on and kind of giving this inspiration, but just, again, for kind of being who you are, you know, to be so honest and transparent with other people in the middle of your your own season of grief, and you're doing something with it, and you're speaking into the lives of other people, and that's what we need. We need life coaches as peers, the people that you interact with on a daily basis, not just at a gallery or when you're out speaking at a function, but I know that the people that you rub shoulders with on a daily basis learn from you because you are intentional and because you want to make a difference. And I think that, to me, has got to be the big takeaway today, from whether it's someone that is dealing with addiction or someone, like you said, that is interfacing with someone that's dealing with addiction. It's do something, say something, and don't be afraid of the fallout. I have a close friend that is a very prominent person, and his addiction, so many people didn't say anything because he was in a position of power and they didn't want to lose their job. They didn't want to lose their connectivity to him. And so people facilitated him for so long. And, I was part of a small group of people that, were willing to speak up. And seeing that you're challenging other people to do that is super encouraging. So it kind of, as I wrap up every week, into the work on learning to appreciate people, it is this idea of appreciating others. And I can, with complete sincerity and honesty, say that early in my law enforcement career, I did not appreciate others. And I went out and did a job that I thought was serving my community, but I found a better way to do it, a better way for me and a much more effective way in the community. And it was that idea of appreciating others, whether they were my peers or whether they were offenders or someone in the addiction community. And it comes back to that mantra that I'm not perfect. Nobody is. I have value. Everybody does.
Mm-hmm. And Simone, I tell you sincerely, I mean, this show, it is a show, and we try to, put content out that matters so that people get something out of it. But personally, I selfishly have enjoyed this show probably more than most, just simply because you are so impactful as a human being, making the eye contact as I'm talking about. I feel bad that our audience doesn't have that privilege, because I can feel the energy about who you are and what you're trying to accomplish, and when most people would just crumble. And you've been an unbelievably encouraging human being to this person in recovery. So,
thank you.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Well, we appreciate the audience tuning in to 100 Proof Living, where we believe that change lives change lives.
Thank you.